I started writing about grief in the 70s. When I began, I read every book I could find, and that was about 3 books. There just wasn't much written at that time about grief. And not knowing what else to do, I began to just utilize the groups and try to put together something. And I started off using stages of grief. Every author at that time did. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had come out with a book on death and dying, and she talked about the stages that we go through in preparing for death. So we just borrowed that and put all of it into stages. And the first book I wrote had stages, of grief. I didn't like that term very well even at the time because it seemed too clear-cut and too organized. I don't think grief is organized. I think you flip-flop through stages, and you can be at up one and back to the other one at any time. And so I've looked for another definition or analogy, and I came up with one. Some lady somewhere said, grief is like peeling an onion. It comes off one layer at a time, and you cry a lot. And I really like that analogy because if I handed onions out to a whole audience, nobody would have an onion exactly like everybody else's onion. Everybody would have an onion that would be different, and that's the way grief is. There are no 2 grieving experiences that are alike. If you have 2 losses, you have to grieve them individually because they're not the same. Every grieving experience is different. And that allows me to talk about some of the dimensions of grief. When I first started off, someone would always ask me, what's the hardest kind of grief? Is it harder to lose a child or a spouse? Is it harder to have a sudden death or death after a long-term illness? And my answer always would be, well, grief is just grief, and it only comes in one size, extra large, and it just hurts. But within that definition, I have to say there are some dimensions in certain kinds of grief that are heightened. Now, these dimensions are in all other kinds also, but they're heightened in these experiences of grief. For example, the grief following the death of a child has a significance dimension. And significance has become one of my favorite words, which you'll hear later. I picked the word up in Missouri. A lady was visiting with me and told me her story. She had married young in life, and her husband had died quite early. She remarried, had a family, had some children, and then a child died. And she was explaining to me the difference between the grief following the death of a spouse and the grief following the death of a child. She said the grief following the death of the spouse is a process of turning loose, of saying goodbye. And the grief following the death of a child is a process of hanging on, of trying not to say goodbye. Because she said you don't feel like the child has lived long enough to establish their significance, and you feel like you have to establish it for them. And that word resonated in me. It's like we need to walk through the world for them. The grief following the stillbirth has a lonely dimension to it, because the mother is the only one that really knows that child. She bonded from the moment of conception. She knows what college the child will go to, and probably who they will marry. The father has some kind of concept because he may have gotten to feel the child kick in the womb, but the mother knows that child. And her problem then becomes explaining the significance or the value of that life to a world that thinks stillbirth is minor grief. I cannot tell you how many times I've had people walk up to me and say, I had a stillbirth 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and tonight's the first time I ever knew it was okay to grieve that. Murder or sudden death has a delayed dimension to it, particularly murder, because until they catch the person and go through the trial, and the trial itself is a horrible experience for the family. Until that's over, the grief is kind of on hold. Other kinds of sudden death, the shock is so deep that it takes a while before they can actually begin to deal with the grieving experience. Suicide has a shattered dimension. You feel like that the onion has just been blown apart, and you have to put it back together before you can ever begin to grieve. Families will almost research. Part of the time we're looking for blame. What caused it? Who did it? Who said it? And I always say a little poem that says, "Was the final straw that broke the camel's back. Then men noticed the fiendish pack. But who among them ever saw the next to the last straw?" Because a suicide is the result of a combination or a culmination of all kinds of straws that one day become overwhelming. And it is not, well, his girlfriend quit him, and therefore somebody said this, and therefore. The other great problem with suicide is everybody feels so guilty. We automatically think we should have known, and we automatically think we could have stopped it, and neither are true. The only person that can stop a suicide is the person who died of suicide. And it's very difficult for us to know. I was counseling a young man one time, and we'd gone through a lot over a period of time, and he came to see me one day, and I thought, my goodness, he is so much better. He has improved. He seemed more relaxed. He had some plans for the future. I was excited when he left. 2 hours later, he shot himself. What I didn't realize is that once they make the decision, the pressure is off, and a lot of times they seem to be better. So it is very difficult for anyone to know. That doesn't mean we ignore all of the signs that they give, but it's very difficult, even with those signs, to actually know. And therefore, the guilt we feel sometimes is unfounded. I also like the onion because if I handed an onion to everybody, each person would peel the onion in their own way. You know, some people would play with the little things where it comes together at the top. Some would play with the little things at the bottom. Some would peel it very daintily and very slowly. Some would just tear it apart. And the truth is, you're going to peel an onion. You're going to grieve about like you'd peel an onion. We grieve like we are, and out of who we are and the kind of personalities we are. The onion also is a good analogy. If you take the outside of an onion and you crumble it up, it becomes confetti. And if you did that and threw it up in the air, and the wind caught it, that would be a pretty good description of the first part of grieving. It's a whirl. Things are just in a whirl. It's shock. It's a period of unreality. I mean, reality's up there, but it doesn't land. You know, when my brother died, every once in a while I'd think I won't see him again, and then he'd be gone. It just hits and runs, and you're kind of torn between two feelings. Part of it is I think I'm overwhelmed. I don't think I can live over it, and the other part is I'm really angry that this happened, and it's just kind of whirling, and it's not real. It's like a lady said, we're sitting here talking about planning the funeral for my son, but I expect that door to open at any moment and him to walk in. And it's like going to a sad movie. You know, you cry, but the credits are going to roll in a minute and it'll all be different. One of the problems I have, and one of the problems that people in grief have, is we get the most help, or we give the most help, when people can receive it the least. During the whirl, we're all there. Oh, we're bringing food in, we're taking care of things, we attend the funeral, and then most of us all go back home, and the family moves, and the loved one is left there, and the whirl begins to settle, and you get into that first layer, which I call reality, and that's the most painful time. It all lands. The reality doesn't just come and go, it's there, and you begin to realize that you're not going to see the person again. And you cry until you don't think you can cry anymore, but you can. And you call somebody and don't even know why you call them. And the pain, it's amazing how much physical pain there is in grief. It's painful, and you experience the pain, and you hurt. You know, I sometimes think we're worse off 3 weeks after the funeral than we are the day after, because we're in that shock period, and then all of a sudden it lands and we're there. I've wished that companies would allow people to come back to work pretty quickly and then give them time off later when the pain actually hits. When people are grief, or in reality of grief, I think they need what I call the 3 H's. They need us to hang around, they need us to hug them, and they need us to hush. They don't need a lot of talk. They just need presence of people who will be with them during that period of pain. gradually we move from that very, very tough, painful part to the next layer of the onion, which I call the reaction layer. We begin to react to our grief. I say that what happens is we hit bottom and get mad. There's anger in grief, and that always is surprising, but it shouldn't be, because anger is a natural response to hurt. But it creates a little bit of confusion with people, because they stop and say, well, I don't remember getting mad, I don't remember getting angry. But you see, anger has many forms. We think of anger as lying in the floor, holding our breath till we turn purple, but anger is also hurt. It's also frustration. It's also all those emotions that come, and we begin to react to those emotions, and we begin the reaction sometimes comes out in questioning, why me, and I don't deserve this, and where was God? All of those kind of things are called anger, and they all come from the same emotion as anger. And so I just lob it in and say it's anger, and it's very healthy, because basically it becomes the drive that makes us push on. We begin to fight back to our grieving. Now, we still need to deal with that anger. You don't just swallow it. You need to get it out. You need to deal with it. Swallowed anger creates depression. And there are many ways to deal with it. I think sometimes it helps to do physical things, like, hit something, or put a pillowcase up in the garage and stuff it with something so you can hit it, or get a hammer and nail, just something to hit. I had two friends whose sons died, and the first Easter they put colored Easter eggs on golf tees and hit them with golf ball clubs all over the backyard, and said the next year they're going to leave some of them unboiled, just so they wouldn't even know which ones they hit. But there's something physical sometimes helps. I think sometimes writing helps. Writing orders the mind and helps us kind of keep things into order. I put it kind of crude, but I say you just need to keep your cussing current, and don't leave here thinking that I've just told you to curse. I use two words. Cursing is using God's name in vain and saying bad words. Cussing is expressing anger and frustration, and you need to keep that current. You need to tell it. And sometimes I think we need to tell two stories. I bumped into a lady recently who said, I do need to tell two stories. I need to talk about my husband who died. But she said, I also need to talk about what it was like to watch him die as he became ill, and then to live through all that experience. She said, I've got some friends I could talk to about him and his death, but I need somebody I could sit down and talk to about what all that experience was and what it did to me. You see, the problem with anger is it doesn't just go away. It has to be dealt with. And it doesn't float well. Basically, it's not enough to be angry. We have to be angry at something. And anger will settle on something. It won't float. And where it settles sometimes scares us, but it shouldn't. There's some places where it seems like it shouldn't settle, but it does. For example, it's not unusual for anger to settle irrationally. It's not unusual for a wife, for example, to get angry at her husband for dying. Now, he may not have had anything to do with it, but you'd be amazed at how many women have stood in the front room and said, why did you leave me like this, John? And then they feel like they're absolutely gone crazy. That isn't a sign of insanity. That just means that's where the anger focused, and that's a pretty good place for it. Some people get mad at God. That also is a good place for anger to focus. God's big enough to take our anger, and we don't have a real relationship with somebody we can't get mad at. It's okay to be angry at God. It scares the preachers to death, but it's okay. Sometimes the anger settles on our mates, and that's a tough thing on the marriage, but at least the anger is out, and it's there, and something to work on. It makes it very tough. A lot of people get angry at their ministers, or their doctors, or their lawyers. All of those are uncomfortable, but they're not unhealthy. The one place we don't want anger to focus is we don't want people to turn it inside and focus it on themselves. And you know when you're doing that because you begin to obsessively play the game of if only. Now, everybody plays some if only. I'm talking about obsessions. just it becomes something that just absolutely dominates them. They build very elaborate scaffolds to prove that it is their fault. I had one family I went to see whose the daughter-in-law was murdered, and the wife said, she wasn't angry. And then I said, really? She said, no, I'm not angry. But she said, my problem is I went up with the kids when they were looking for an apartment, and I found that apartment, and I took them over to see that apartment. Now, she said, if I hadn't done that, they wouldn't have been in that apartment. If they hadn't been in that apartment, the person wouldn't have found them there. Therefore, it's my fault. And I said, I'm glad you're not angry. And she said, what do you mean? I said, you're just as angry as your husband. You just don't feel comfortable being angry at the person who did this. So you're going to turn it inside and be angry with yourself. Anger refocuses when we really realize that anger is what we're dealing with. When we can sit down and say, I am angry, and I have a right to be angry. And when that begins to happen and we begin to deal with it, gradually, then we can refocus the anger somewhere besides ourselves. The last layer of the anger, of the onion, I call reconstruction. I used to call it recovery, but we don't recover. We simply turn the corner in the way we cope. And a lot of times we know when we do that because there'll be things we can't deal with now that we can deal with then. Something you can't give away, something you can't even use that belong to your loved one. I said to a lady one time, in your own schedule, in your own time, the day will come when you'll decide to get well, and you probably know it because there'll be some experience like that. And she said, it's the desk in my den. So what do you mean? She said, I have a roll-top desk, and said all the pictures are in it. And said, I closed it and I locked it. And she said, the day I can open it and clean it out, well, that'll be the day that I know. Well, she called me in the middle of the night one night and said, come over here. And I went rushing over there. I thought something was bad wrong. And she was standing in front of the desk, and it was open and clean. She decided to get well again. You may get up to that many times before you get there, but there comes a day when you decide to live again. Another lady said she sang in the choir one morning, was walking across the street getting her car, and right in the middle of the street it dawned on her that she had to decide whether to live or die. One of the reasons I think we shouldn't just automatically clean out our houses is that dealing with those things is part of peeling the onion. We need to deal with them as we get ready to deal with them and as it becomes something we wish to do. I finally met a lady in Pasadena that had a car. Everybody always talks about the car the little lady from Pasadena owned, and she only drove it on Sundays. But I met a little lady. I spoke in Pasadena. She held up her hand and said, you just explained my husband's 55 Packard. I said, what do you mean? She said, he had this Packard, and said it was his pride and joy. And when he died, I had to fight the family to keep it. Because everybody said, oh no, it'll remind you too much, it's too sad, you got it. And she said, I just fought him and I kept it. And said, I can't tell you how much anger I worked out there polishing that car. Said it had more chrome on it than you ever saw, and I'd polish it a while and cuss Charlie for dying. And said, one morning I woke up and I wanted to get rid of it. And said, I put an ad in the paper, the first person came out and bought it, and when he drove off, he had the same silly looking grin on his face my husband had when he bought it. And it was okay. What was she saying? She was saying, I turned the corner in the way I cope with my grief. And that's the hope.